Cool. Before I dive into that too much, I'm going to tell you a little bit about who I am and why I want to chat to you about pen test programs. So I'm Caitlin. I'm one of WithSecure's global consulting directors. I work across the UK and the US. I got into security about 10 years ago as a pen tester in South Africa. So it's been a while since then, and I'm doing a very different job. Why do I want to chat to you about pen test programs today? Well, like I say, I'm doing a very different job to when I started, but pen test programs are one of the things that's actually been fairly consistent for me throughout my career. I started out testing them and seeing it from that perspective, then helping other consultants get onboarded. Now I'm a lot more the operational side of things, making sure things run smoothly, seeing where we can do things better. And I've also had the privilege of seeing them from at least 3 different countries. So I'm from South Africa, I work with the UK, US. I've seen it across multiple industries, and that gives me the luxury of sort of a breadth of experience that I don't think is common outside of consultancy. So hopefully means I've got some insights. The second reason I want to chat to you about them today is a very selfish one. So I'd say right now, if we're doing assurance work, more often than not, that is part of a pen test program. So if I've got insights that are useful and there's something that can be taken away, at the end of the day, it's probably going to make my life easier, because the smoother pen test programs run, the smoother things go for me. So pen test programs are incredibly complicated. I mean, you will all have dealt with them. You'll be a lot more aware of the challenges of just keeping something running in an organization that size with a ton of different people with different requirements. And it's complicated by the fact that, I mean, security is not what it was 2 years ago, 5 years ago. Everything changes. Even beginning of this year, we will be doing different things. We're seeing different things. And your pen test programs can't be static because they've got to respond to that. So you're working in an environment that's constantly changing. You're working with people with different demands. And what I've often seen is that sort of the pressure and the complexity that's involved with that sometimes means that the foundations on which they're built are not given the TLC that they need. And sort of my key observation across all of the pen test programs that I've dealt with over the past 10 years is there's a couple of core just basics that when those go right, almost invariably the pen test programs will go right. Nothing's perfect, so they might still have problems, but they're more easily recovered from and everything works smoothly. And those basics are just having great communications and being able to align on expectations. Now, you need to do that sort of between a few teams. This is a very simplified version, so I appreciate there's a lot more detail than that. But for the purposes of my talk, I've sort of got 3 key groups that I see as involved in a pen test. So you've got the security team, who obviously they own the pen test program, they're running it, they want the quality, they're balancing the business needs and trying to get everything together. You've got the testers, which is my perspective. So I'm approaching that from sort of an external vendor perspective, but it applies equally to internal testers. And then you've got the product owners who own the things that need to be tested. So they might see security once a year, they might see it sort of on a more continuous basis, depending on how it's set up, but there's usually a fair number of product owners and they've got less frequent interactions with the security team. So I want to start on the relationships and so the communications and expectations between the security team and the testers. Diving straight into that, the biggest thing that I've seen here that just helps everything run smoothly and is successful is building relationships. And those are sort of relationships across a few different levels. So you've got the project management side of things and the technical things, and you've got that both at the security vendors and internally within your security teams. So building those to a point where you've just got a comfortable flow of escalation, you know. So if you want to provide feedback, it's providing feedback. It's not, oh, this is an escalation, don't usually deal with that person, and now they want to chat to me, what's going on? But it also gives you sort of a lot of insight into what are the priorities and how do the processes work and where are so the security team's priorities within those processes, and how can you keep up with the changing needs? Because, like I say, security changes, and I don't think I've ever been involved with a program that is the same in January. It was the same in December as it was in January. And that's not major changes, you know, you're not ripping the whole thing up and changing it, but you're tweaking, you're getting better, you're saying that didn't work and this did. So just kind of being able to chat about that and chat about it easily. And like I say, the feedback is a huge thing, to just be able to say, this worked well, this didn't. Now, the most important thing I've seen for actually doing that is just regular touch-ups. Regular touch points, sorry. Everybody is busy. Like, if you only if you don't have something regular planned, what happens is you have an engagement, you chat about the engagement, and then you move on with life. And that's both sides. We don't remember to keep up and sort of keep in contact. So setting up time where it's like, and it can be quarterly, it can be monthly, it can be fortnightly, whatever suits you, and it can be super formal or just really relaxed. But just having something where it's like, at least once every this frequency, we are going to chat. And that just sort of helps build and maintain those relationships. And then making sure that frequency, like I say, it kind of works for technical and project management and everybody involved, so that you can build that up. But then if you've got a relationship, sort of how can you use it effectively? So these are a couple of conversation topics that I've usually found, certainly from a vendor perspective, allow us to be more responsive and make sure pen test programs are running the best they can possibly run. So I already touched on priorities on the previous slide, and the obvious thing with priorities is what's important. Equally so is also what's not important, because there's always going to be a point in the program where you're going to have to make a decision on what comes first, what comes last. And I'm not saying that your vendors are going to make that for you, but that they can at least approach you and sort of say, hey, we're seeing these conflicting interests. These are possible solutions, and that kind of line with your priorities can still be something that you correct. Then also just an understanding of blockers when it comes to priorities, and, what can be a blocker in your process flow? Which parts of the process do you care most about being blocked? The most obvious example I've got for that is almost every client I work with will say, if you have a critical or high-risk finding, we want to know about it in testing. Please don't wait until the report, because we need to get it fixing now. And it can be other things like that, but it's just, what is going to make your life difficult, and how can they help to make sure that, the blockers are going to happen? That is what it is. But how can your testers make sure that it doesn't impact you more than it needs to? The next thing is, what do you do when testing doesn't go as planned? So, there's a few ways this can go. Might not get requirements, everything gets delayed, or somebody finds something really interesting that they didn't think they were going to, and there's a lot that you can do from that. And the main thing you kind of want to know there is again, I suppose it's priorities, but where do you want to go from there? So I've got some clients who say we're testing a web application, we find something that gives us access to the underlying infrastructure. They might say, develop a POC or dive into that. I know the infrastructure is out of scope, but I want to know what that does. We've got other clients who'll say, okay, great, that's nice. I need the breadth of coverage, I need this test to be done on time. So all of those are valid approaches. All of them will be very much informed by your business and what you want. But sort of having that idea of, how fixed is the scope? What do you want us to do if something goes wrong? How do you want us to respond is very helpful, because then if you have those situations, your testers can make a decision, still inform you, keep you in the loop, but they can keep on doing things. Then the case where, okay, oops, something has gone wrong, we haven't been able to test. Again, what's your priority? So testers can do a lot of things. They can, I don't know, if you care particularly about finance or transactions, they can say, okay, we're going to focus on the transaction part of whatever this is. They might be able to say, we're time boxing it. These are our priorities. We're getting this. Or they might be able to say to you, we can extend this, but sort of what works best for you will depend on what your business needs. So again, that's just a useful conversation topic. Then my final part is just support timing. So the first thing people think about when I say this is sort of, when are we going to be busy in the year? And that's definitely useful information, but I'm thinking about it more in the context of when in your process flow do you need support? So I've got some some clients where they have their whole year planned out up front. They can say, we're going to need this skill set in this quarter, this in this month, and we're going to need this there, and that's great. But I've got some who will find out literally a week or two before a test is required, because their internal process flow is that when somebody has completed something, that's when they escalate to the security team, and that's when they get it tested. And in those situations, people will very often want, a lot more hands-on support when they find out, because they need to get things done. They've got a lot of internal communications going. So they really need us to be on the ball with sharing information with them. So thinking about, in your day-to-day, where do you need the most support? Where do you need the most communication? Where's it most critical to you is important. To kind of give an illustration of some of this stuff, I'm going to go into a case study. I've got a case study later. So what I've done is I've created a fictitious corporation that we can use for the case studies. The corporation's fictitious. The examples are ones that I've encountered throughout my career. all of them in the past 2 years, I'd say about, so they are more recent. Corporation is the very creatively named Example Corporation. Working at Example Corporation, we've got Sipo. He's part of the internal security team. He sort of runs the pentest program, and he deals primarily with customer-facing products and critical internal security apps and making sure that those are tested. Then we've got Anne. So she's from one of the vendors. She worked quite closely with Sipo as well as being a tester. She's also the technical lead on the account. So she tries to make sure that he's getting the technical support that he needs. So we're in a monthly service review. It's a bit free form, and Anne sort of brings up the fact that she would like to discuss a few changes that she's been seeing that have been requested to the report. Sipo's happy to go into this and asks for a little bit more detail. So Anne's detail is, well, there's two situations. The first is that we often see that in the daily stand-ups, we might mention something that is, related to application availability, and it hasn't really impacted testing. It's just sort of general conversation. But when those come up in general conversation, the security team will inevitably ask them to please raise that at a risk. Now, from Anne's perspective, a slight lack of availability, a little bit of slowness isn't really a risk. It's not something that they usually highlight on a pen test report, and she'd like a little bit more detail on this. Sipo can jump straight into that one and sort of is happy to provide context where, from his perspective, availability is their top priority. It's one of the things that they feel is a differentiator. And so their agreed process flow internally is if something can impact availability, then at the end of the day, they want to investigate it. It might not lead to anything. They might decide this is minor, it's part of life, but they want to understand the root cause. And so from their perspective, they want anything related to availability, however minor, sort of documented so they can dig into it further. So that makes a lot of sense. And Anne and Sipo then begin to figure what can they do. And Anne's proposal is essentially just, well, our consultants can then basically add that as a finding on everything and make sure that they're flagging it, because there's probably a fair number of consultants who aren't flagging it because it just isn't going to be something that they consider. They're both happy, and move on to Anne's second example. So Anne's second example is that she often sees cross-site scripting downgraded. So they'll put it in as a high or a medium, and then suddenly they find it as a low, or being asked to downgrade it to a low. And she wants a bit more context on this. This one, Sipo has to look at a little bit more, but he thinks about it and then gets back and says, well, at the end of the day, from his perspective, he doesn't often get a lot of context on what you can actually do with cross-site scripting. So they give a lot of general sort of, this is what cross-site scripting could do, but not what could this example do. So again, they sort of discuss, this makes sense, and they come to the conclusion that it's going to be best if the testers develop a POC for any of these, so that when they work with Example Corporation, they can really contextualize that and decide what that risk is to them and if it is important. So with that, I'm going to move on to the relationship between testers and product owners. There's a little bit sprinkled in here that relates to the sort of security team and product owners relationship, but or expectation management and communication there. But that is something I see very much sort of second or third hand. So although it's in there, I'm very much focused on the sort of testers and product owners. Now, one of the things with testers and security teams is you've got a fairly consistent group of people working together. So you can build those relationships and you can use them. But product owners very often aren't in the security process as much, or there's a far broader pool, and that can become a little bit challenging to have individual relationships with everybody. So what becomes really, really important is the aligning expectation side of things and being able to do that. So some of the worst places where I see trouble with aligned expectations are anytime we're testing for a product team who's never been tested before. That will almost invariably have something that doesn't work out. The next thing is, like I said earlier in the presentation, testing programs change. There's usually minor details that differ. But if you haven't been in it for a year, those might seem fairly major to you. So if we've got somebody who does get tested every year and is very confident in what testing was, when it's different one year to what it was the previous year, we again run into those misaligned expectations. And then the third place is where there aren't clear role definitions. So sometimes product teams will have a very big say over what's being tested. Other times it's going to come very much more from the security team. And what we'll sometimes find is where it's not absolutely clear who has the final say or why they have the final say, there'll often be sort of just a lot of discussion, a lot of round and round. And it's not that that can't be resolved. It's just usually quite time consuming to establish, do we need this testing? Are we testing the right component? And all of those things. Now, how that manifests from sort of a tester's perspective is First, an inability to get the information that we want in scoping. So I've definitely been on my fair share of scoping calls where I get a question and it's like, oh, why do you want to look at this? Users can't interact with this. This is machine to machine. There's nothing you can do here. And then we have to explain, all the testing that we can do, or where we might offend people a little bit because we're looking at insider threats and they don't particularly like the implication of that. So, and then we might struggle to get what we want. The opposite end of the scale is people who are very over-enthusiastic but don't know the information that we want, and we'll get an 800-page document, which, again, we can process through, but us trying to figure out what is the most important information is often pretty much guesswork. So you kind of get those two ends of the scales. Now, trouble getting information in scoping can lead to a lot of back and forth in scoping, but also on testing and in findings. So one of the more common ones I'll see on the findings front is, oh, but why did you report that? Like, that is a different team, or that is related to this, or, anything along those lines where effectively we've just got that sort of misalignment. And again, most of these they're going to take time. You can still get through them, but it's a lot easier if you've got a framework for aligning expectations. Then finally, challenges with requirements. So this is where it can really hit testing. But as a tester, you're coming in knowing that you know nothing, you have no access. But for the product teams, they might say, oh, you need to access that web application. I can provision you credentials, and then you move forward. But that web application is sitting in an environment where we actually need to be listed into that environment before we can hit it, or there's some special requirements, or we need an AD account, or any other number of things that could become a problem. But because for the product team, they always have that access, and the only change for them is the credentials, that's all they think about. And that can manifest in a few different ways, but essentially just trouble sort of getting requirements. One of the other ways that can sort of more broadly go into, though, is testing environments. Now, you might have asked a pen tester this question. If you haven't, somebody in your team might well have. It's always wonderful when you can't access anything and suddenly somebody says, oh, but you're a hacker, you can get there, right? And that, again, it goes back to that sort of misalignment of expectations where what's the outcome of the test? What do you want? And we can see that other places in testing environments too. So I've probably got three main ways that we test. The first one is from our laptops. And that's obviously, from a tester's perspective, that's the ideal. You have all of your tools, everything works, you know what it's doing. Second one is where we'll be provisioned VDIs or something similar, Citrix instance, but whatever we do, we're going to be within your environment on a host controlled by you. So what can happen there, and what can happen with the last one as well, which is where we actually get laptops and we get set up and basically get completely onboarded like we are one of your employees, is the environments are for normal business users, which doesn't work for pen testing. Now, that isn't quite actually a relationship or alignment with the product team so much as it is with background IT, but it sort of shows up in those instances where you're testing. So the ways I've seen those solved that are really useful. So like I say, our ideal is always testing from our laptops, but that's not always feasible. Having a set of pre-agreed tools that sort of meet the internal requirements for any checks you need to do that can be uploaded on your internal app store and we can access. Having a specific VDI created for us. So that might be Linux-based, might have all of our tools, might be used by multiple testers, but basically having something that we can sit down with you and chat about and say, this is what we need. And yeah. So onto the second case study. So again, we're back with Example Corporation. And what's happened with Example Corporation is they're migrating all of their internal infrastructure, or the vast majority of their internal infrastructure, to the cloud. They're quite late in this cloud migration project where they realize, actually, we want testing done. And they haven't organized this. So they go across to the internal security team and say, we want you to set a pen testing program, but time is of the essence. Like, this needs to happen as fast as possible. Security team has vendors that they work with. They have internal testers. They know what they're doing. So they say, great, we can make this work, and we'll get back to you. So they reach out. They start everything going. The first couple of tests happen, and nothing is going right. So we're back to Sipo and Anne, where they sort of reach out to each other going, essentially, this is not going great. Can we have a call to discuss? And they try to figure out what's going on. So in their discussions, a few things they've noticed: scoping takes forever. It goes round and round. Eventually, when they do get to testing, they often won't have the access that they need. When they don't have the access that they need, they're struggling to get it in the testing window. So digging into that a little bit more, and discloses that basically the first scoping call is always explaining to the team what they need to do and why they need to do it and how they can test it. So very many of these people have never been tested before, and they don't have any expectations about this, and they are very confused because usually what they would deal with is user acceptance testing, and that's not relevant for their cloud infrastructure. So that is one of the key problems that they're running into with scoping. When they finally get through that, they will provide a lot of unrelated information, and that means that sometimes when they start testing, they touch systems that they're not supposed to, or that are covered by something else, which they'll then have to deal with. However, that is when they get to the point of testing, because the other challenge that they've run into is you actually need to be allow listed to be able to connect to the AWS console. So all of the consultants have the accounts that they need, but they can't test. And when they escalate this, because they're onboarded onto the client's internal systems, they have client emails, at no point have the products teams realized that they're dealing with external vendors who are only there for a fixed amount of time. So they usually have other projects on, and they can't drop everything to support with this access problem. So it's often taking longer and longer to debug, and this has just generally gotten to be a problem. So again, they go through a few solutions to try and figure out what they want to do here. And where they end up with is they're going to make a few adaptations to the program. So the first one is they're going to have a very defined scoping template, which has a lot of background information they wouldn't usually include, including sort of methodologies of the testing and what they're looking at. They're also going to make it a lot clearer, the information that they want, which they'll do through the use of a questionnaire, so that they can sort of prompt and get people thinking about what they're actually looking for. In parallel to this, SIPO is going to relook at the internal pen test documentation, because while it is really well documented, it hasn't been understood properly by the product teams because they don't have the context that everybody else who engages with this program does. So they start looking at that. They're also going to pull out any of the assessments coming up because they're going to run into the same issues and basically space those out a little bit more. And they're going to introduce the need for a pre-project call. This hasn't been something they've had in the past because everybody's been tested to death. They know what you need, and usually everything's in your inbox on the first day. But they're going to go to 2 weeks before any assessment. There will be a call. Everybody needs to be on, and they need to be able to test requirements. If that doesn't work, they can then move the tests out so that they aren't losing time having consultants chasing requirements instead of testing. Now, all of those are kind of in general, or in specific versions of general recommendations that I've seen for what works really well in a pen test program. And I think the sort of 3 biggest things I've seen that really help with aligning expectations between the product team and the consultancy is first just having great documentation on a pen test process, making sure that that documentation allows for the fact that some people are going to be seeing this for the first time. So it might not be everywhere, but maybe there's longer timelines, maybe there's more detailed information or anything that they might need. Also, having internal specific examples about access provisioning trouble that you've run into in the past, or the usual process. So usually you're going to have to do this, you will have to speak to these people, and it takes 28 days for a ticket to be processed, or, something along those lines. But then the other thing I've unfortunately learned is people don't read. And so you can have glorious documentation, and it's going to help with maybe 60% of your problem, but it's not going to touch the other 40. So for the rest of that, one of the things I've sort of observed people doing that's really helpful is just having call outs. Those are often just like short emails at the start of the test, which will be like, hey, it's your first time being tested, so please be aware of this documentation. But right now what we need from you is X, Y, Z. And then there might be a follow-up later on. And I love those to bits. They are incredibly useful. And like I say, they usually prompt people to go and look at the documentation that they haven't read. Then just shouting out to vendors. So going back to the relationships in the beginning, being able to say, hey, these guys are new. Please give them a lot of extra TLC and make sure that they're getting the support they need. And then finally, the other thing I love to bits is pre-project calls, because yes, they've helped solve a lot of things, and it's a lot nicer to deal with trouble before the test starts than being in the middle of the assessment and going, okay, we need to get this done, but we can't get anything, and how can we help with it? So I would always insist on a pre-project call. Now, I started at the beginning of this saying, the basics get lost because there's a lot of complexity going on, and I've probably just spent half an hour chatting to you. So I'm sure a lot of my points have gotten lost because I've been jumping from point to point. So I kind of want to finish up with just sort of a few key takeaways from me, which I hope are helpful. the first one is, please look at building relationships between your security team and your testing team. So that can be any of the vendors, any of the internal teams, but getting them to a point where they can just sort of comfortably chat to each other. Then look at a framework for managing expectations. And the goal of that is to allow you to work flexibly, to deal with new people, to respond to situations, but have a framework that works for you that does that. And then build a robust standard process and communicate that out. Like, I'm sure that's happening in 90% of the cases already, but make sure that it has that contingency for new people and make sure that it's kind of well understood by everybody involved. And then, I think there should be time for questions.
Any questions? Then
Cool. Panel.
Hearing some of your challenges about requirements, access, etc., it feels like a lot of those should be handled by the security team and they should be the liaison between. Is that typically the way it goes, or do you still find that they're not engaged or they're not the ones paying for the test and it's actually the project itself?
That is so very dependent on the client I'm dealing with. So some clients, it's 110% the security team. They're across that, they're on it, and they'll sort of call out, they'll be on the calls and they'll chat to us. For the rest of them, sometimes it's either it's well documented elsewhere, or very often what we'll see is the product teams are actually, so they might be involved in sort of agile sprints instead of standard testing, and they're used to dealing with that, so they'll take a bit more of a hands-off and then we can escalate to them. Or where it goes really wrong, I have encountered teams where the security team just has no involvement at all.
Fair enough. Thank you.
any other questions? Thank you.
Awesome.